Praggnanandhaa played an absolutely incredible game yesterday against Giri in the semi-finals of the Chessable Masters. So he had white here. This is online chess, rapid play time control. He kicked off with pawn to d4, and here Giri goes in for the Grünfeld defense. So knight f6, pawn c4, g6, knight c3, and now he strikes with pawn d5. So we had a captures on d5, the knight recaptured, pawn e4, set up the big centre, takes on c3, pawn recaptures, and now the bishop comes to g7, hitting the beautiful long diagonal. And now there are different ways for white to set up here. Knight f3 is a very common move, but then you can be running into this bishop g4 stuff. Lots of theory there. Pragg goes for this line with bishop to c4, and he's clearing the bishop out of the way, so that after pawn to c5, undermining the centre, now this knight comes to e2, and it's not running into any bishop g4 pins. Both players now castled the king. The knight came to c6, pressuring the centre, and you always have to be very careful as white about kicking on this d5 pawn. Sometimes you can do it, but you open up this bishop, of course, and that's why it's a double-edged move. So instead, bishop e3 was played, just holding the centre there, and now pawn to b6. So it supports that c5 pawn, but it actually offers up a gambit here. So if white wants to take that, then we can see you're actually winning a pawn. The main response from black is queen to c7, and if white takes again, pawn recaptures, well, we can see black's compensation here. You've got lots of play down the c-file. This pawn is very weak. The knight's coming to a5. It's a roughly balanced position, very theoretical. But Pragg didn't go down that line. He didn't take on c5. Instead, he played a very interesting move here, rarely seen, pawn to h4. Such a modern way of playing, throwing this h-pawn. Now we'll see that this pawn comes all the way down the board. If you go h5 as black here to try and shut that down, well then after the simple queen to d2, coming onto the dark squares, this is just a good pawn structure for white. I mean, say you go e6, targeting the pawn with the queen, then the bishop can hop out. That's a bit uncomfortable. You don't really want to go f6 or put the bishop there and let them swap off. So this is good for white. We didn't have pawn h5 therefore. Instead e6 was played, immediately opening up the queen, and now the pawn kicked on. It went to h5, but Giri played the move here, which is really the acid test of the whole variation. So he goes queen to h4, hitting two pawns here, and Pragg doesn't defend either of the pawns. He calmly goes queen to c1, bringing that onto the dark square, lining up a battery with the bishop. Now why c1 and not d2? Well, possibly he wants to eye this knight in some lines, which is unprotected. And this is just great preparation from Pragg, because you can't actually capture either pawn at this point. If you take this one, then the problem is knight to g3, and the queen's actually getting checkmated. So say it comes to g4, well then we switch back with bishop to e2. Queen h4, bishop g5, you run out of squares, that's a lost position. And equally, if you don't take the pawn on h5, just running it back here, if instead you take on e4, well again there's this knight g3 move, tons of problems for the queen, it's just much better for white. So neither of the pawns were taken. Instead, Giri took on d4, and we'll see the difference now that this move makes to all of those variations, because after the pawn recaptures, now he takes on e4 here, and the difference is if you go knight to g3, now the queen can hide on h4, because if you go bishop g5, just like before, trapping in that queen, well now this pawn's undefended, it's no longer defended by the pawn on c3, so the queen could chop here, black's actually winning. So that's why Pragg didn't play the knight to g3 here. He left it on e2, he just calmly played rook to d1, bringing more pieces into the attack, and so for the sake of a pawn, he's got a nice initiative now. And the best move for Giri here was actually dropping the knight to e7, preparing to come into d5, that's a very important square. Instead he went knight a5, a more ambitious way to play, hits that bishop, but this is now a problem, because after knight c3, lovely in between move, hitting the queen, Again, you don't want to come to the king side because the bishop dropping back to e2 is a problem. So the queen comes back to b7 instead, but now bishop e2 anyway. It's heading for f3, and this knight starts to look a bit silly on a5. It's running out of jumps. So this one now came to d7 developing, so that after bishop to f3, you can play bishop c6, but first Pragg flicked in this pawn h6 move. And again, this is such a classic modern way to play, so you're not pushing that h-pawn to then rip open the h-file. Instead, you want to squash back this bishop and create mating threats potentially later on, cramp that black king. So the bishop now came to f3, bishop c6, and now an excellent move by Pragg, again just seizing that initiative, opening up this dark squared bishop, which is a bad piece right now. He goes pawn to d5, giving another pawn here, so he's now 2 pawns down. And now we see Pragg's whole idea, it's not to recapture that d5 pawn immediately, but go bishop to d4 here, just create more weaknesses around the black king. So the rook now came to d8, holding on to that extra pawn. Pragg took in the corner, the king recaptured, and now an absolute star move here. Pragg chops on d5. It looks like you're just losing a piece, but here's his trick. He doesn't actually just recapture with the rook and we exchange like this. Then of course black is winning a piece up. Instead, he flicks in this queen to d2 move. And now we see the power of this pawn on h6, cutting in the king, because if you capture on f3, then we can take here, and there's back rank problems, you can't recapture, or that's actually checkmate. So we didn't have captures on f3. Giri went queen to e7, preparing to support pawn to f6, so that after queen c3 check, which is what we saw, pawn f6, only now does he recapture on d5, he wins back his piece, and here actually Giri didn't want to exchange, bring the bishop into the centre very, very powerfully. Look at that knight on a5. So instead he hopped to c8, hits the queen here, and now another absolute star move from Pragg, so tactically astute in this game. He goes rook to e1, counter-attacking on the black queen, and if black takes here, then we take on e7, and again it's just a great endgame for white. We can see all the problems here, still back rank problems, and the much more dominant minor piece in this position. Whoops, meant to fire to b7. So coming back here, we didn't have captures on c3. Giri instead went queen to c7, and you could already actually capture here on c7, play rook d6, good endgame for Pragg. But instead he goes queen to a3, he's looking to invade down here, and Giri now finally brings this knight back into the game. It hits c4, but Pragg gets to invade. He goes queen e7 here, and Giri now blunders. He cracks under the pressure. He should actually just take this queen off the board. Then after the rook recaptures, you can go knight to e5. You don't want to give up this wonderful bishop. It would drop back. Knight c6 holds the pawn. White's still a lot better. You've got rooks coming to the 7th, but you can kind of grovel here, even though it's a bad position. But he didn't go for this one. Instead, after queen to e7, he played knight e5, cutting this connection here, but completely missing the fact that here Pragg can actually snap off that rook. He took on e5 here, and now there's nothing that black can do. If you take the queen, we recapture, we're a rook ahead. If you do as we saw in the game, pawn recaptures rook, well now rook d7 is the problem. But here's the beautiful calculation as well. You're threatening mate here, of course, but what do you do after queen to c1 check? Because if you go king h2, this is a losing move, then the queen can take here with check, and you defend the pawn on h7, now black is winning. But what Pragg did instead, after queen c1 check, he dropped this bishop back, hits d1, and now it's just game over. Yes, Giri takes here, he covers this pawn, but now there's queen e5 check. And this was actually the final move. Giri resigned here because mate is unavoidable. So if the king comes to g8, then the bishop's hitting b3. That's the problem. You have to give up material, then you're getting mated. So a lovely game from Pragg. Now Giri did strike one back, so they went to tie breaks, and Pragg then actually won on the tie breaks, won his first game, held the draw in the second. So phenomenal stuff. The 16-year-old reaches the final where he'll be playing Ding Liren, who beat Magnus Carlsen. And he was saying that he was up till 2 a.m. in India playing this game. Then at 8:45, he had exams that he had to go for. After his exams, which are taking place today on, what day is it, 25th of May, he's then playing Ding Liren later on in the finals. So what an incredible player, what an incredible guy, going without sleep, really phenomenal talent. I'll be covering that game tomorrow. I hope you can tune in. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.